Essential question 4 is, what were the diverse sources of the antebellum women's rights movement and its significance? So, as many women, especially middle class women, engaged in these reform movements, in particular advocating for the abolition of slavery, they became more aware of their own subordinate social and legal status in American society. In fact, many female reformers often compared marriage to slavery. Here, it's important to kind of remind you guys about the status of women in early American society. Just remember that Republican motherhood, cult of domesticity ideal that assumed that women were inherently more moral than men. And it's interesting to point that out here because the idea that women had a moralizing influence over the family also kind of implied that they could have a moralizing influence over society at large, meaning that their involvement in reform movements wasn't all that far-fetched and wasn't really all that far outside of what women's traditional roles were, interestingly. And sometimes this was even referred to as social housekeeping. Now, the big event to talk about here is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This is, again, one of those things that shows up on the test very frequently. It's very important to remember, and it's a seminal moment in the women's rights movement. In fact, it tends to, for most historians, this marks the beginning of the American women's rights movement. The Seneca Falls Convention was a women's rights convention that was organized by two reformers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who themselves were both abolitionists. The delegates to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 issued a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled very closely on the Declaration of Independence, and that was intentional to try to draw those connections about freedom and liberty and equality, those foundational American ideas, and it's structured very much like the Declaration of Independence. So rather than saying, all men are created equal, in the preamble says all men and women are created equal. Rather than being a list of grievances against the king, it's a list of grievances against men, etc., etc. So the Declaration of Sentiments called for women's suffrage, which unfortunately will not happen until 1919. It also called for the right for women to retain property after marriage. In society at the time, when a woman got married, her property was then her husband's property. She had no more legal right to it. The Declaration of Sentiments also called for greater divorce and child custody rights for women, and it also importantly called for equal educational opportunities. So, the Seneca Falls Convention is a major moment in American history and certainly women's history, and like I said, it's traditionally marked as the beginning of the women's rights movement in America.